Speaker, Danny's been debating with me for 2 years, and he's kind of sick of me already. My parents put up with me for 18 years. I think this means, at the very least, that I owe a moral obligation to them. But also, we're going to be proving in the speech why we think this benefits society on the whole and kids within families around the world. What's our model look like? We think that kids owe their parents, so the parents who either raised them or paid child support in the case of divorced parents, a minimum standard of living. So this includes things like shelter, food, and so on, once they reach a certain age. If children can't afford it, so the children themselves are on welfare or whatever, we obviously aren't going to require that they support their parents. In these situations, we think that the state will support in the way that it normally does. So it seems this is fairly straightforward. We don't think that's too controversial. So 3 arguments in this debate today. First, why we think children have a particular responsibility to take care of their parents when they're old. The first and foremost thing we're going to say is that the reason we place a burden on parents in the status quo to take care of their kids is for 2 reasons. First, because we think that children are a particularly vulnerable group of people, and second, because we think these parents are best placed, to take care of these people who know them. Go ahead.
Yeah, okay. What about the people, like abuse, for example? Is this they have to have a conviction back when the abuse was still happening? Is this just like the testimony of someone 40 years later saying that their parents abused them? Would that be enough? Where's your bright line?
So, we think that in a lot of these cases, child support services have already paid visits to these people and made cases. In the situation that doesn't exist, we think there will be testimony if you have evidence. We think that this can be, in the particular cases that these happens, it can be on a case-by-case basis. You can decide based on the evidence. So we think that in the situation of parents, we think parents are also a vulnerable group because when they reach beyond a certain age, they can't access a lot of jobs in society. They can't be as economically productive and take care of themselves in the same way that kids couldn't when they were young. But secondly, we think by nature of being old, they're also susceptible to things like health issues out of no choice of their own because they didn't choose to get older. They happen to them automatically. We think in this situation, they represent a vulnerable group that children have a responsibility to take care of. Why is that the case? Because we think in this situation that children are the ones who have the best knowledge about what situation their parents are in, what kinds of things they need, and what it means to take care of them. We think in the same way that we place a burden on parents to take care of their kids, we do this for the parents as well. But the second, more direct reason is because we think children are a massive investment for parents. So you put a lot of time, you spend a lot of money on these kids that you could have been spending on yourself instead. So instead of taking a vacation, what you do is you spend on your child's education, you spend on your child's healthcare, and those things. But more importantly, instead of setting aside money for your own retirement, you spend that money, there's a direct trade-off, you spend that money on your kids for the variety of things that parents have to do for their kids, for their clothes, for their shelter, and so on. From a moral standpoint, we think that means that you are directly obligated to repay them for this investment, exactly because you are morally responsible for them not having saved up enough money that could have bid them over and in their old age. No, thank you. We think that explains why you have an obligation. But even if you don't believe that a moral obligation exists, this is still a policy we can implement. We show you that it has tangible benefits to society on the whole. So 2 sets of benefits. First to parents and people in society overall. So what are the benefits to these people? We think in the status quo there's a large issue, especially in the West, that people are less willing to save over the long term. We think that this is massively problematic for the economy as a whole because this means that money doesn't go to the most productive places, there's less investment, and so on. We think that when kids know that they have to take care of their parents in the long term, there's a massive incentive to save over their lifetime in order to ensure that they have enough money at the point at which it occurs to take care of those parents and to invest in things like their healthcare, their shelter, and so on. Secondly, we think a problem that exists across the West is that social welfare systems that are supposed to take care of old people are under huge amounts of strain because there's a large amount of people who are aging, and the young people that exist to tax in order to pay for these services is falling. We think these kinds of high levels of taxation are harmful within society because it reduces the amount of economic activity that occurs within these societies as a result of the fact that you have to pay for these aging populations. Instead, a setup where kids pay for their parents' requirements once they've reached a particular point of time, we think causes people to internalize the kinds of demands that are placed upon them, as opposed to harming the economy overall. Go ahead.
Surely the moral obligation, if it stems from the fact that they gave up things for the children, also stems from the fact that they decided to have a child for which they could have foreseen giving up those particular instances of happiness.
Sure. So we think that they could have foreseen that. First of all, a lot of parents don't foresee that in terms of like lots of parents don't choose to have kids. Like a large number of kids are accidents. But secondly, we think even in the situation where they choose to have them and keep them, we think the fact still remains that parents directly place things like invest in them, even though they could have saved. Like, for example, you can provide your child a basic level of safety, but we think parents often go beyond that. No, thank you. And that directly trades off against future savings, and we think that's the reason why you have this obligation. So what are the benefits, what are the final level of benefits to the parents? We think particularly poor people and people like single mothers, for example, are the least likely to have the ability to save in the status quo, because the amount of money that you spend on your kids means that you don't have much money left to save for your retirement. This placing the burden on the kids, we think, places an incentive for them to ensure that their parents are taken care of and makes it more likely that these people are taken care of in their old age. The final thing we're going to talk about is why this benefits kids and family structures overall. Three kinds of things here. First, we think that parents in general are more likely to invest in kids if they know that what they're doing isn't just being altruistic and trying to take care of this organism that's been foisted upon them, but rather that you're just borrowing against future income. That if your kids are doing well in society and have a lot of money, they're more able to take care of you in the future than if they're not. Secondly, we think that the way the law is structured also changes culture over time, right? Because the way people react depends on, the way people behave in society depends on what the law expects of them and what's allowed and what's not. We think so over time what this means is that parents and families are more likely to do things like stick together and take care of their kids, exactly because of the fact that they know that there's a direct stake for them from an economic perspective. It makes sense for them to do this because they're essentially making sure that once they're old and they can't take care of themselves, they're ensuring that there's someone who will take care of them. But the final thing we think is that in the status quo across the West today, you see that what parents do is essentially say that once these kids are 18, we're letting them out, they're adults, they can take care of themselves, they have to take care of their own student debt. We think this policy places an incentive for parents to take care of their kids even at this period and guide them in things like decision making, because the better these kids do in these formative years, in places like college, in places like when they're making their first employment decisions, the more likely it is that these people have the income to take care of their parents. And we think this places an incentive on parents to take better care of their kids. This benefits society overall and is a moral obligation incredibly proud to propose.
I'd like to thank the Prime Minister for that speech and invite the Leader of Opposition to open up the case for the hot bench. You're here.
All right, Honorable Speaker. I think that when you look at children as an investment solely and not as human beings, that not only leads to bad moral outcomes, but bad practical outcomes for those children and parents themselves all across society. 2 points I'm going to talk to you about in my speech and why Tavish and I think that these laws are particularly bad and are probably a lot of the reasons why government programs aren't that successful. I'm going to talk to you about firstly why it puts the burden on children. I'm going to analyze it from the perspective of children and parents. Then I'm going to talk to you about why I think this system is principally unjust, even regardless of the practical benefits I'm going to talk to you about. First point, that reputation of everything we hear coming out of government bench, but I think there's easy responses to pretty much everything they talk to you about. First, let's get right into it. Why does it put the burden on children and what is the problem, right? So the problem is that when filial responsibility laws exist, the narrative around the way in which parents or the way in which old people are paid for shifts, right? So the narrative becomes about it is the responsibility of the children to pay back for the parents primarily, right? That should be the primary actor in these types of situations, and therefore it is simultaneously the responsibility of the parent to ensure that their child ends up being successful in the long run. The reason why Tavish and I say this is particularly bad is historically, first of all, the reason why these laws were implemented in England initially and then were carried over to the colonies in North America is because people in England wanted to absolve the government of the responsibility to have to deal with these types of things, right? And that is what the narrative has been used to do and what the narrative has been used to propagate. And the mechanism by this is that the narrative is then, it is the responsibility of the children to pay back for the parents, so if the child is failing, it is the parent's fault, right? So the state doesn't have to step in because there's another actor who has more of a responsibility than the state to actually care for the parents in these types of situations. And that's why particularly political will is stopped, right? But why does that lead to bad practical outcomes for children and parents? In terms of children end up worse off for a couple of reasons. First of all, I think it's pretty obvious that oftentimes if you are in a poor socioeconomic situation, but probably you have enough money to spend on your parents, then you're going to just be worse off, right? That means less opportunities to go to university or make decisions, right? Because you have to make your calculus as a child based on what your parent needs in those situations, insofar as it's your responsibility to pay back to them. We think that oftentimes that means children can't take the types of long-term solutions that they might have to if you are living in a poor poor environment, go to university or get yourself out in that thing, right? But even it's just a large upfront cost, right? Front government says it's a huge amount of money to pay for your parents. Tavish and I would say, don't make people who are trying to establish themselves in the world make that payment, right? What we'd say the comparative ought to be is a government who makes the payment for children and expanding the types of systems. But the reason why it can't happen and the reason why it disproportionately puts the burden on children and you can't have a perfect government system when filial responsibility laws exist is because the narrative will always block any political will to change the system because you can just say, it's not the government's fault, it's the people's fault for doing these types of things. It also neglects diverse situations like if your parent develops cancer and you have to pay their hospital bills. That disproportionately affects certain people due to random chance or random circumstance, and we think is entirely unfair for children in these types of situations, right? Especially when you're talking about children who are often probably raising their own children at the point at which they have to pay for their parents, which we think particularly makes it harmful for those children in the long run, and you end up trapping people in this type of cycle. Why is it harmful for parents? 5 reasons. First of all, we'd say they don't get the state apparatus that actually protects them, right? So recognize that a lot of people who are born into environments in which they don't have the same types of advantages mean that their children do not have the same types of advantages to get the types of money to pay back into their parents. So they end up having to rely on a state system, which, how can I tell you, is incredibly shitty for all the analysis I just gave you. Secondly, we'd say is that children start to see them as a burden, right? So government says, look, now you're going to view your children positively, right? Because your parents are going to treat their children positively and children are going to view their parents positively. I actually don't think this is how this plays out remotely, right? Recognize if you have to pay hundreds of thousands of dollars to care for your parents, to give them shelter and food, you're probably not going to view them as anything more than a burden on you and your ability, I'll take it in a second, so lead your life in the way in which you want to lead it because you are always tied to them in a situation which you never opted into. So I actually think that leads to worse outcomes and probably more neglect from children to their parents. Sure.
The situation where you view your parents as a burden is when you think that your parents haven't done enough for you. If you believe our arguments and you consider our arguments that parents will do more for their kids, doesn't that improve their relationship?
Oh, so I don't believe your arguments, right? And I'm going to explain in refutation why I absolutely don't believe this is actually how it's going to play out. I'll be very explicit in response because it's literally just refutation at this point. Third reason why. We'd say that people probably work longer to not have to retire, right? If you're a parent who wants your children to not have to pay for you, you're probably going to be forced to stay in the workforce longer to try to neglect that burden on your children, which I think is particularly hard. And oftentimes when you're doing long-term financial planning, probably something that isn't stable for the reasons government says about you probably not being able to get reasonably employed when you're older. But we think probably people are going to long-term plan to do these types of things. The fourth reason why I'd say the narrative becomes that parents who are struggling or have to rely on their children failed as a parent to raise their children properly, which I think, again, feeds back into the system of less support for these types of things. And E, I'd say, last reason I'd say it just neglects single parents in situations in which you don't have that child support to care for you in those types of situations, and which I think that ought to be a legitimate choice. So we think there's really bad practical outcomes for parents and children vis-a-vis the system and the way in which it plays out politically. Yeah. Secondly, why do we think it's an unjust system, even if it might play out well, right? So first of all, we think it's unjust to parents in a couple of regards, right? So we say that first, we can't expect parents to be able to fully control the outcomes of the lives for their children insofar as there are determinist factors, insofar as there are free will factors in the way in which children act. So we can't reasonably expect that it's a total control of the parent to determine the outcome of a child in a way in which it is their outcome, right? So we'd rather have a system, and I'll take you in a second, which the government or their retirement savings, which they have full control over, at least reasonable control in the government, can affect these types of situations. We also just think that children are bad actors when you're talking about them multitasking their lives and probably not necessarily caring about their parents as the priority, right? This is the direct response to the things that they say about parents and children knowing about their parents best. If you're trying to raise a child and maybe you live across country, you're probably not going to know what's best for your parents or actively care about the type of situation. So we don't think these are good actors, and we don't think it gives the proper control that we ought to have. Sure.
Mitchell, I love my mom. I'm probably going to take care of her when she gets older anyway. This is a debate about the people who don't like their parents and feel just because they don't like their parents, they have some kind of responsibility that they can just shirk. Why do we think it's okay for these kinds of kids to just forget all of the resources the parents poured into them?
So we think it's fair because the parents opted into that relationship and the children didn't opt into that relationship with the parents, right? So we think the reason why is that the parents actively chose to have a child and consented to those types of harms possibly existing. That's why we think it's the government who ought to take the burden off the child to give them the most advantage possible, which is why the second part of this, we think it's unfair to children because they didn't opt into this type of system. We think it's principally okay for children not to want to give back if you are a sexual minority, and even though you weren't neglected or abused in that relationship, we think oftentimes it is hard to interact with families, and you shouldn't be forced to do so by the state and to relive the types of harms that even if it wasn't abuse you occurred as a child. We don't think also that children should be viewed as investment in this manner. So we think principally and practically it's wrong. Refutation of some outstanding outstanding material I didn't already refute from the government case. So a couple of things. So first of all, they talked about moral obligations and that parents are vulnerable. That's actively true, right? The first point about why parents are vulnerable is true. The question is whether it should be the child or the parent or the state who is the actor to step in to provide for that vulnerable group. Tavish and I would say in a situation in which you can't guarantee that there's good outcomes from children providing that outcome, it ought to be the state who is always going to be uniform and always can mitigate these types of actions, right? That's why we think they should be the actor. We think that they opt into the system and that's why they consented to it. In terms of social benefits and the parents investing in a child, they talked about how parents want to do more. This is the response to the POI. The reasons why parents won't necessarily want to do more is, A, I think parents have reasons for children for reasons of love, and if they only want to do more because they are investing in their child, then they're probably going to be shitty, overbearing parents and probably not to lead to good outcomes. For all these reasons, we oppose.
I'd like to thank the Leader of Opposition for that speech and invite the Deputy Prime Minister to come continue the government case. Be heard.
Speaker, recognize that this debate occurs in a wide variety of cases, that not all families are the families that I think is the implicit assumption of opening opposition, which is a nuclear family with two parents planning to have a kid, investing a lot of resources. Rather, that's increasingly the minority of cases of what families actually look like. Let's analyze the spectrum of this debate and why the likeliest example is something that flows towards OG. So recognize that there are many different types of families. You can have rich nuclear families, in which I don't think this motion makes much of a difference, because rich parents will have enough savings anyways that it doesn't really make a difference, and their kids will be wealthy too. Then you have nuclear families that happen to be poor, in which this motion doesn't make much of a difference, because they're going to do this action anyways. I think where this motion likely applies is the case where you have many families of that what look like today, like single parent families with lots of disruption. The bonds tend to wear off as soon as the kid is old enough to survive on their own because of the fact that there are many trends going on, that there's a lot less having kids after getting married, there's a lot less education, there are a lot more single parent families because social norms are changing, and this is highly correlated with economic status, so these families tend to be less well off. So what we tell you is that in this specific situation, these kids are less likely to give back to their parents in the first place because they don't necessarily have the same family bonds that characterize strong nuclear families, and also these parents are likelier to be disproportionately burdened from raising these kids in a way that we think we need to provide more services to them. So why in this specific instance do we think this policy is uniquely helpful? One, because you help the parents, like the single mom who puts extreme amounts of resources into taking care of kids because she doesn't have a husband to support her financially when she does so, which means she doesn't put aside money to save. This means this policy accounts for the fact that she was disproportionately burdened because now she gets money from the kids, whereas the person who goes off and leaves her alone does not. The second thing, though, is I think you do actually change norms and incentives regarding this behavior. Because now doing something like spending extra money tutoring your kid or spending extra time on your kid is not just something that takes from your ability to work a minimum wage job, but is also a way of securing income in the future. I do think you actually get behavioral changes from that, and you actually account for the nature of these families. The significance of this contextualization of the debate is that a lot of the answers we get, like, oh, parents will do this anyways because they love their kids, presumes a type of family that just realistically isn't the majority of cases, or at least it's not the majority of what this debate should center around. We provide an added layer of social support. It also means the stuff about how parents don't fully consent into life doesn't make sense because in a lot of the time in these families, life is unpredictable and we should provide additional guarantees of insurance. We do that on our side of the house. But so I think that frames a lot of the debate. But now I want to talk about social narratives. A lot of this is in refutation to the beginning of the stuff we get from opening opposition. So they say that we're changing the narrative so that it's a question of whether children and parents, it's seen as reflective of their success. I think they're opping an idea that is much larger than the specific policy, because recognize it is already a norm that parents are judged based on the success of their children, and children are judged based on the success of their parents. I don't think this one law makes the meaningful difference. But even if it is the case that we have norms that children are responsible to their families, I think that's good because it promotes intergenerational connectedness, this idea that you should be responsible for your ancestors, something that's like very prevalent in East Asian societies like Japan, and I think in general those cultural norms are good things to encourage because it increases support for welfare systems like Social Security, because it's this idea we have an obligation that extends to the elderly, extends beyond us. That's one reason why welfare has worked and persisted a lot longer and more effectively in Japan than it has in the United States, where you have increasing cuts. But then they say that it provides a narrative that children fail, so we should cut off services for their children if their parents were problematic. I think that it's the opposite, which is just that like we want policies to encourage tight-knit families, and this law is one way of doing that. But in the case we don't have that, we can have these other policies. Closing.
Okay, so if you're so concerned about having, security in old age, why wouldn't you just pay for a nurse or perhaps save up some money? This is a trade-off because you want the joy of having a kid. You should have to pay for that.
So, first of all, I don't think every parent has a kid just for the joy of having a kid. But secondly, I think, even if you mess up, even if you have a kid and then you can't account for future income, I think people are bad at making long-term economic decisions and we shouldn't throw them away. But this leads into the third thing I want to talk about, which is government policy. So opposition tries to paint this as a comparative between social welfare programs for the elderly and having kids take care of the elderly. I don't think that's the accurate comparative because in the status quo, there's already decreasing support for programs for the elderly. Why is that the case? One, you have the rise of right-wing parties, and based on this idea of government extending too far, specifically in the United States and the Tea Party, but even nationalist right-wing populist movements in European Western liberal democracies. The second thing, though, is a lot of developed countries have aging populations. So the fact that the baby boomer generation is over means that these systems are over-constrained and it's too much to pay for them, increasing the political impetus to make cuts. The third thing is just that government efficiencies accumulate over time, and because taxes are politically unpopular, there's more of an incentive to cut these programs. The implication of this argument is that there's already decreasing social support for the elderly and parents who are seen as needing help. What we do on our side of the house is provide an additional layer of support, an additional safety net that does not rely on government bureaucracy, does not rely on people taxing and taking money, but rather just encourages these connections between families. I think that addresses a lot of what they say because it means these people get help. Sure.
So there's going to be lots of people who you can see on your side of the house will not be able to afford these types of systems insofar as they're really expensive. The types of things that you do by enacting this type of motions hasten that process to a degree in which I think it is impossible to reverse it and impossible to protect the people who are the most vulnerable.
Sure. So we said in the model that if you cannot afford it, likewise how a parent might not be able to afford taking care of their kids, that's when social services step in. We're fine with that. I think it's unrealistic to say they're not able to pay. But maybe the more sophisticated version of this argument is that there's a trade-off between taking care of your elderly parents versus taking care of a younger family. But I think we still accept that trade-off because it means we have families that are more interconnected. It's not just you leave behind the generation before you to take care of the next generation, but you recognize it's interconnected. That leads to stronger families and stronger networks providing support for people in times of uncertainty, especially as the state social welfare system is stepping back. That's incredibly powerful because it provides an additional guarantee. Then they say that children will just view their parents as a burden. I don't think that really applies because I think we still change the incentives of how actually having kids. You still get money from doing so. Then they say that people will work longer because they can't retire. That's already happening in the status quo. If you only live on Social Security without saving, you're living in poverty. We are doing something to actually help those people and provide an additional layer of support. Finally, on these concerns about morality, how the kid doesn't necessarily decide, I really think it's the same way. Just as you're unsure about what your parents will have to do, your parents are necessarily unsure about the rise of childcare. They get a huge financial burden if their child gets leukemia. We still expect them to care about that. It should apply the same way because oftentimes there's no other option for these people.
I'd like to thank the Deputy Prime Minister for that speech. Invite the Deputy Leader of Opposition to come continue the op case. You're here.
Okay, everybody ready? Panel. Here's what I'm going to do. 2 points of constructive, and then refutation explicitly line by line of all the things that they talk about. For my 2 pieces of constructive, I'm going to first ask the question, what will being old be like? And I think it's going to be shitty. And then secondly, I'm going to talk about abuse and why I think they're bright line, even though I gave them a point of clarification about it, was never clarified in either of their speeches. I think it's massively problematic that a bunch of kids who were abused wouldn't be able to meet the legal threshold and would be held responsible for their parents. Actually, that's pretty much that point, now that I realize that. That's pretty much what I have to say about that. Okay, so then the next constructive. Well, what is it like being old? I think being an old person without financial security becomes very victimizing. I think it's very shitty on their side of the house. And the reason is that you are instrumentalized by the government for the purposes of creating broader social goods, right? So they talk about how this will be in the first speech they talk about how the economic benefits of things like that, or in the second speech they talk about fixing the relationship and making sure there's a support network there. But recognize that almost every interaction you're going to have with your kid is going to be transactional, right? We're behind the guise of oh good, you brought the kids up. It's I have upcoming medical expenses. I need these tests to be done. And these sorts of things are what actually eat into the relationships between children and parents, right? Recognize that on their side of the house, if a parent has medical fees and they can't pay for it, they have to take their kid to court for this. This is, by the way, the law that is on the books in 30 states in the United States. And the only time we hear about it is when either they're shithead kids or when they're shithead parents trying to get things out of their kids, right? Either way, it's a system that's likely to be abused. I don't think it does anything to repair broken families or people without without safety nets and stuff like that. I think that when you make the interaction, the relationship between the parent and the child, like one of being parent and child, as opposed to, or when you switch the parent and child relationships, I think people are uneasy, and I think no one has a good time. It just sounds very sad. We just think the government should pay for all of it. Fuck it. Okay, so refutation. So refutation, the first speech, and then the second speech. First of all, there's the intro about how, Dan's been with my partner for 2 years, while I lived with my parents for 18 years. Like we had said, your parents made that choice to have that, to have a kid, and they say, oh, but it's an accident. Your parents didn't, slip on a banana peel and end up pregnant. They know what they were doing. They know what they were doing, right? That's what it's for. That's what it does. So yes, accidental families do happen, and people understand that when they take that risk, but also we try to minimize that by offering things like reproductive healthcare services, meaning you can get an abortion, or you can have access to birth control, or condoms, for example, right? So we try to limit access to, we try to prevent accidents as much as possible, but even recognize that if you believe accidents are a thing, they are not most of the cases, right? I think for the most part you can say that when people have kids, they have made some sort of choice or step where they have accepted that yes, their life is going to be shitty for the next 18 years because this guy, and I think that they've made that choice, right? Okay, but then they talk about how parents are old people are a vulnerable group. Absolutely. Why the fuck are we letting shithead kids who, as both government teams want to talk about, the kids that are affected by this are the kids who don't really care that much about their parents. So why are those kids the best actors to help those vulnerable people? And also, this material, and when he gives you the false comparative at the end of the speech, completely ignores my partner's point, right? Because my partner actually does set up that comparative and talks about the political capital costs when something like this happens, right? Now, as Mitchell, this is just Mitchell's constructed material, right? Now when you advocate for more welfare services, what it's seen as by the voters is, oh, you're giving the shitty parents whose kids don't love them enough more money, right? I think it's different, and I think it's far easier to have those welfare programs when everyone is forced to have contact with it. This is why the New Deal was a thing. We can debate about whether that's a good thing later. Yeah, sure.
Don't you think it's more likely, though, that with this system, children will now be likely to lobby and advocate for better social security and healthcare reform, so you actually get a better safety security net in our world than yours?
No, I don't think so. I also, I just don't think there'd be a difference in that, right? I think for the parents who love their kids, or for the kids who love their parents, they're going to advocate for the exact same, right? They obviously want those better social services for their parents. But for the kids who don't really have a great relationship with their parents, I think they're more likely to just pay off their parents, never visit, and just not bring it up, right? I don't think they're likely to take on political activism, although I'm excited to hear that out of constructive. No. Next, I'm talking right about your material, so I don't even feel bad about not taking it right now. Then they talk about how, but there's a trade-off instead of retirement. That's not how retirement works, right? Your money goes into a pension or a 401k. It's not a direct trade-off between saving up for retirement and spending it on your kids. That's just not how pensions work and how entitlement programs work. Also not how taxes work. Anyway, but then they talk about the social benefits. They say kids save money for this. Kids will start to save money to pay for their parents and stuff like that. I think that's not good, right? I think it's bad to be saving money for your own kids and also for your parents. I think there's so much risk there and so much saving is necessary. I just don't think people spend as much money or they don't do as much cool shit. They don't take their kids on vacation. Take kids on vacation. Nextly, they talk about how there's different incentives now because you can parent better. You're going to love your kid more because he's going to pay you off in 20 years. Parents who care about putting time or money into raising a kid as an investment are already shitty parents, right? I also just don't think that those kids exist, given that we have that system, and I just don't think it, no. Okay, but then second speaker. He says, we need to talk about the non-nuclear families. We were talking about nuclear families because that's where your material is strongest, but anyway. Then they say, what about single moms, right? Single moms should have to, they should have their shit paid for. Yeah, I don't understand why the government shouldn't be the people paying the single moms, right? Just as I think you should probably get money from the government just for being a single mom. But I don't understand why having the kids of a single parent be legally responsible for that parent, especially financially responsible for that parent. I don't understand why that's a system that provides more security for that parent. They say this is a thing in Japan. Yeah, it's really shitty. It's really bad for young girls, right? They don't like young girls because men benefit from the sexist business industry in Japan. So having a girl means that you won't be able to be taken care of super well when you grow up. It just leads to lots of sexism and infanticide, and it's very sad. Also true in India and China, for example. Also, old people have it way easy in Japan, and I don't think that's good, right? 20% of young people are unemployed because old people won't leave their jobs. I don't think that you can just say it happens in another country, therefore it has to be a good norm that we should bring here. No. Then they talk about the comparative, and I've already talked about why the comparative that they set up is a wrong one, right? I think that because the people who are left out, the people who social services do have to step in for, those people are hurt on their side of the house because the ability for us to improve the situations of those people are necessarily tied to the political cost of advocating for increased spending for a socially stigmatized group, right? Recognize that, but both government teams have decided they want to talk about, the parents and kids if they don't have a good relationship. I think spending money on that is just remarkably difficult, and I think it's far easier to provide important services for vulnerable groups when their kids are responsible for them. And I don't see a benefit in this. We're proud to oppose.
I'd like to thank the deputy for that speech and invite the member of government to open up back up this debate. You're here.
We think in today's world, we like to glorify youth a lot, right? Once you turn 18, you get to leave home, you get to do whatever the hell you want, and it's all because your parents were there to support you. In today's society, in today's modern world, family structures have broken down to a point where we typically, and governments typically, really only value youth, right? That's why things like Medicaid for elderly in the US and Social Security have consistently been cut and slashed. There's an underlying value in society today that says if you are older than 65 and can retire, you don't add value to our society anymore. You're not necessary. We're going to change this on our side of the house. First, my first argument and point of extension today is how are old parents like children? Secondly, how do we get better policies on our side of the house? But first, I have a few outstanding points for rebuttal. Firstly, when they talk about children not being the best actors, we're talking about children in their 30s or late 20s. So we're not talking about 5-year-olds supporting their parents when they retire, right? I think we need to be very clear that we're talking about elder children, right? So in the same line, that maybe those same children shouldn't be parents because at 25 you can't be a parent, right? I think they need to align whatever no, that's just not true, right? And at the point at which Tavis's only response to any material is, this is shit, no, I think he needs to recheck himself, right? Second point, they talk about this, I know it might be for other reasons, but yeah. The second point I want to talk about is this idea of interactions become interactions between children and parents become transactional. One, why isn't this already not true in the status quo then with things like child support, right? Why don't parents already treat children as transactional institutions, right? If this is already something we do. But more importantly, I really doubt when you're a 5-year-old or 10-year-old, you're gonna go Mommy, I love you, pay the water bill, right? I don't think that this debt is as detrimental as they really want to force it onto you, right? Maybe when you're older and you realize, but I also think that yeah, my parents pay for my tuition. There's already a transactional aspect to familial relationships. I don't think that's exacerbated. But lastly, they talk about this idea of consent, right? And how children didn't choose to be born, and therefore they shouldn't have to do this, right? The same could be said of anyone born into any country, right? Like lottery of birth. Yes, you didn't choose to be born there, but you still have to abide by laws, and you still have to pay taxes if you're in a democracy, because those are just systems like, sorry that you didn't get to consent into where or how you were born, but it happened and you have to deal with it, right? Like, that's life. And we're just like willing to eat that harm on our side of the house, like, sorry about it, like, cry me a river. Okay, so, yeah, I'll take front half, actually.
Okay, so the problem is that when you're born into a situation in which your parent doesn't have the money, that is only for some children who then have to support them, which means it shouldn't be placed on the burden of those children to only support in those situations.
Mitchell. Okay, so OG came up here and told you if you're on welfare, this doesn't apply to you the same. Like, I don't know why they keep harping on poverty and individuals who can't afford this, right? And like, I'll still like, I have a better response for this in my second point of extension, and I'll get to there, right? But at the end of the day, we think like, yes, it is unfortunate that those who are on welfare are still going to be stuck within this system, right? But I think that we still get better advocates to change that system on our side of the house, where on your side it still stays shitty and terrible for anyone who lives in that system, right? And even those who can afford it decide not to help their parents. Okay, so how are parents like children? So, at the point of parents are currently obligated by the state to provide for children, right? Whether it's like child support or also legal recourse for things like child neglect or child abuse, we think that it's a burden that should also fall upon children, right? Because they talk about this idea of removing agency from kids, but every single aspect of agency that we have culminated in this room, every single person here, has been given to us by our parents, right? Whether it's because of the ethics or the morals they taught us, whether it's they worked 4 jobs a week so that they could pay our tuition for something, or not even pay tuition, but just like put food on the table, right? I think that at the end of the day, all this agency, this whole glorification of youth, comes from the principles and comes from the basis that it's all given from our parents, right? I think that, so like, why does the state even care about children, right? Because they're the most vulnerable in the society. They literally have no social or economic mobility, especially infants, right? Like, they can't fend for themselves physically or financially out in the world. And we see that the same thing happens for these elderly parents, right? Because it's not only just a job discrimination, why? Like, the thing about job discrimination is they get up here and like, maybe we'll reform that. But the reason that's never going to happen is because people don't want to hire elderly people because of the health issues, right? Like physical and mental health issues that spiral, like skyrockets insurance rates for businesses. Like, there's a reason that people like retire at 65. It's not just because they want to, it's because they literally become a liability to. So we don't think job discrimination is going to change on their side of the house, right? Even if they want it to. But we also think things like physical and mental illness that just statistically impact elderly generations more inherently make them more vulnerable in society, right? That's why a lot of homeless individuals tend to be older and tend to have physical and mental disabilities, right? Because they are left out and kind of like left out in the wind and not actually cared about in the status quo. Because it's viewed, as I said before, is that people of elder generations are just not viewed as adding value, right? They only pull society backwards. So how do we actually change this on our side of the house? And before I get into that, I want to take people.
So the idea that filial obligation stems from the fact that your parents did things for you is only true of parents that did things for you. This would also apply to people who weren't abused but had shit parents that gave them just the minimum.
Okay, I think even parents who just gave you the minimum gave you some kind of groundwork to get somewhere, right? Like, even if my parents were able to just give me, like, 3 meals a day, that's better than not getting, or 3 meals a week, that's better than not getting 3 meals at all, right? I think that regardless of what your parents do, they work hard for you, especially, like, we are talking about the idea, like, obviously abuse and neglect victims aren't part of this, right? We're talking about parents, even if they don't have the most loving relationship with them, they still had to give up aspects of their life and benefits that they could have received in order to invest in you some way, right? If it wasn't because of love, it was because they didn't want to get screwed by the state with a legal case, right? At the end of the day, we think that parents, even if they don't want to, are obligated by states to support their children, and we think that should be reciprocal, right? At the point at which families are recognized as a special institution. But how do we get better policy on our side, right? So at the point at which we can all agree that Social Security and all these welfare programs are pretty much going down the shitter for elderly people, we have to look at the way that we have to look at the way to actually change this, right? Because Tavish is like, oh, this isn't going to work with kids who hate their parents. Like, they're just going to pay their parents off. No, I think we actually mobilize individuals who are like, I don't want to pay for my parents out of pocket. I don't care about this. Maybe I should actually use the political power that I have as a middle-aged white man or a middle-aged individual who actually has political rights, economic and financial capital to mobilize these things, right? One of the reasons that Social Security keeps going down the drain is that none of our generation really cares about it because it's so long-term in the future that we don't actually see a reason to advocate for it. At the point at which now we are all legally responsible for taking care of our parents, parents when they all have some might have health problems that we can't pay out of pocket for, right? So we need better Medicaid coverage. You actually give an incentive and motivation now for these children to mobilize and advocate for these Medicaid programs, advocate for programs that better society and better the lives of these elderly individuals. We think that you just get more well-encompassing welfare programs, right? And this especially helps individuals that Tavish, I'm not really quite sure if Tavish cares about them, but he's mentioned them, right? All of these impoverished communities. I think that we actually need to get, at the end of the day, we're not necessarily, oh, my voice is gone. Okay, so at the end of the day, what we're really looking for is we're looking towards the future, right? And that's at, 12 seconds. At the end of the day, what we want to do is mobilize those who are most politically capable and competent to actually pass this legislation we're proud to propose.
I'd like to thank the member of government for that speech and invite the member of op to put up the case for closing up.
My voice just went. I might. Thank you. Thanks, Giselle.
Honorable Speaker, Lex and I oppose this motion because we oppose the idea of the family structure being a thing that we need to protect in the first place. We don't think that the state should be incentivizing people to have to stay with the people that they just happen to be born with or have any relationship with them, not even if they're abused, just even if they do not believe in the same sort of things, if they don't get any kind of emotional satisfaction out of being with them, if they just literally don't like them. I really hate the idea that the state is going to incentivize you to be forever attached to them at the hip. I think that's really bad and leads to a lot of outcomes, which I'll give you an extension, and then I'm going to get into refutation. So first of all, why we oppose the family structure as a norm. We think that it's bad that there is, by random chance, the fact that you were born to a particular individual that may be totally antithetical to the way that you want to live your life. So for example, if that's a person like my dad who was a psychiatrist and who had his dad who thought that psychiatry was the devil and that people just needed to find God and they really didn't need that at all, right? It's not abusive, but it was really bad for my dad to have to live with that person telling him that his whole career was against the religion that he should be brought up in. And I think it would have been so atrocious for you to not only say, it's wrong for you to cut ties with your father, but also you gotta pay for him until he dies, right? I think that that's atrocious. Because I think there are a lot of reasons why individuals ought to be able to maximize their own happiness in this life. And that's because, yeah, you do not control where you're born or who you're born to, but I think you should damn well be able to control what happens after that point. Because I think individuals are best able to determine what subjective experiences are best for them. Because side proposition rests on the idea that somehow these parents have been very good for you. We dispute that on face, given the example that I gave, and the fact that a lot of people just don't care about their parents because recognize 2G gave us that opportunity, that this is a debate about kids who don't already feel that obligation to their parents, right? So I think that that's particularly important. But also, you don't actually choose what your parents do with you up until the age of 18 oftentimes, right? So if your parents decided to go on a bunch of vacations to the point where they need you to support them, whereas they might not have needed to if you didn't go on vacation or if they didn't spend things when you were young, you had no say in what they were doing at that particular point in life, and now you have to pay for their bad long-term financial planning. I think that that's necessarily bad. But more importantly, I think that it's bad that people need to maintain relationships with individuals that are ultimately antithetical to the way that they believe. Kids choose nothing, that this is a particular lottery of birth, and yes, sometimes we can't, remove all aspects of chance from when you were born and what you have to go into, but we definitely don't need to add any, right? We don't need to add any attachments to you to a person that you might not be in that particular life. Because here's an outcome of this. When parents have to rely on their children to support them, I think that means that parents are going to be much more controlling of the way that their kids are brought up, because that is, their retirement fund. That they are going to need to have a job, like perhaps be an engineer or perhaps be a doctor, because they're worried about their long-term financial situation. And I'll get to additional reasons why we think that you're not going to be able to have that social security net from the state in a minute. I think that this does a lot of problematic things in that individuals aren't able to actualize on their own happiness and feel a debt to individuals that they didn't consent to be a part of, that perhaps might not exist in that same thing. I really don't think if I was the one going to be responsible for paying for my parents in the future, they'd be down with me studying screenwriting. But that would meaningfully change my quality of life and my ability to access what I'm good at. I think that is a psychological burden on individuals who are often forced to do things that they don't want to do. And I don't think that we need to do that or that we ought to.
So we expect people to pay taxes for welfare even if they don't like the people the money's going to. Why shouldn't we expect the same of children if their parents are in financial need?
Because I just think that paying taxes to a broad base builds up a state that you benefit largely from existing under the status quo, and that you can decide to what extent you want to exist in one state over another. You can decide to what extent you want to utilize those social services, but you don't get to decide to what extent you have to rely on your parents. And sometimes it's really bad, and you ought to be able to remove yourselves from that particular situation. And I think that this is like substantially different from taxation, especially since like your parents may have put you in a position where it's really difficult for you to pay for that. Okay, and then I'll get into refutation now, because I want to start with their first thing, and they thought they like cheekily modeled in like, no, if you're poor, you do not have to do this. It's not that they're poor and can't do it. It's that they probably can, but that takes a lot of money out of what they are personally able to do within their particular life. So yes, you can probably pay for your parents, but that's going to take out from a person who might have trouble paying for that, who can, but who might have trouble, and a person whose parents, are financially stable in the future doesn't have to do that. And that puts them in a relative imbalance between people in the workforce that they probably shouldn't have to deal with in the first place because of the way in which they ended up being brought up. I think that that's bad. But then they say, look, that parents, are unlikely or are going to be more willing to spend on their child when they know that this is going to be something in the future. First of all, I'm not sure why this is true. If you have a safety net in the future, I'm not sure why you're spending, necessarily more money on your particular child, especially since they argue that people are so bad at financial planning. Like, they might just end up with no money to be able to support themselves in the future. I don't know why they're going to be able to foresee, how successful that child's going to be. Because the second response is, what if that child doesn't take what you've given them and doesn't take, the opportunities you've given them and actualize on them? Because I'm so bad at math, and if my parents decided when I was 10 that, I was going to be something that involved math, I would be really bad at it, and that would be wasted income at that particular point. And I think that doesn't necessarily mean that this kind of payment leads to a better life for that child, which they rely on for that argument to work, or that it leads to more money being available for the sustenance of that particular parent in the future. Yeah, go ahead.
Why does choice outweigh reciprocal obligation?
No, it's not. Sorry, personal choice to leave. Just because I think people are generally happier when they don't have to deal with individuals that make them unhappy. And I think that the state should be maximizing the individual choice of individuals once they're on this earth, and that the family structure as a whole is an oppressive one, often one that people find difficult to leave, and any barriers that the state puts on that particular person to say that you have to exist in the area in which you were born, I think necessarily is bad. So why do I think that you're not going to get the kinds of palliative care or pensions that you would get under the status quo? I'm going to add things that we hear from front, because I think it's true that the family who can afford to pay won't largely be using these particular services. So that's whether or not the child can pay for them, or that's whether or not that particular parent is able to pay for themselves and doesn't need that child. That means that the people who need to utilize this particular service are oftentimes the most politically disenfranchised, as Front said. But what does that mean? That means that I think that the critical mass to provide a state structure with which to provide these things is removed. So I think you oftentimes have to go to the private system and pay for that, oftentimes where it's more expensive and more difficult to access, because the private incentives do not align with government incentives that are oftentimes to provide better access for individuals. But if that critical mass isn't there for the economies of scale to make sense for them to do it, which I don't think it does if they're relying on a lot of kids being able to do this for their plan to be a good idea, I think that massively removes it under the status quo. So what I don't think side proposition proved at all was that the family structure is one that is worth protecting, that the system under which they're giving us a way out is going to actually lead to better outcomes for parents, and it's on that basis that we are proud to oppose.
I'd like to thank the member for that speech and invite the government whip to come close off the case to the gov bench. You're here.
So I think where CO actually misstepped is this isn't just a debate about the philosophical relationship of a parent and a child. It's about that too, but it's specifically about law and what the state needs to protect, about to whom they have an obligation and to whom they need to secure the proper rights. To that question, we say the most vulnerable in society. Because when ASIM gets up here and tells you that some children who aren't impoverished but are lower middle working class, right, have to pay for their parents, it's going to be a financial burden on them. I accept that's probably true, but I think that the counterfactual they're missing is that you're going to be leaving these parents to utter economic depravity, right? Which I think everyone's accepted that the state can be a good actor, but it generally doesn't have the resources in the status quo to be as effective as actor as we would all like them to be, right? So I think that what they have to contend with is the idea that when you are necessarily condemning these parents to like a worse off lifestyle, why that is principally justified, especially when we think parents have given their whole lives up just to support you. We think that there is a reciprocal duty that is worth protecting in law and in coding to make sure that ungrateful children can't just run away from filial obligations. So we think that there are 2 points of clash in today's debate. The first, is there a principal obligation of the child to the parent that should be encoded into law? And secondly, in which world are these vulnerable parents better off? So I think on the first. So we get from opening opposition, and again, kind of in closing opposition, the opt-in idea, right? That like, oh, well, like, you couldn't opt into being born to your parents, so whatever. And also, like, with Aislin's direct response to my POI basically being like, our principal stance is that people are happier when they don't have to do this, and that's enough for us. I just reject that entirely. I think that firstly, like, I think that Izzy's analogy of like you can't choose that where you're being born into a state doesn't necessarily mean you don't have obligations to that state. The whole point of that analogy is to explain that like even though there are those kinds of arbitrary distinctions of where you end up in life, we see in other sorts of scenarios the same kind of like law protection of duty being something that we think is important and something we think the state ought protect, right? We think that in this way, like I don't understand why choice is necessarily more important than upholding this reciprocal duty you have within a family. I think it is actually just a Western value to say that choice is important, liberalism, woo enlightenment. I think that in a lot of Eastern societies like China and Japan, which have cultural contexts of filial piety, choice is just an argument that wouldn't stand in those societies. We think that you have to look for like the reasons why a state might protect something other than just saying people might feel self-actualized. I don't think that's enough. I think that these laws secure and encourage better protection for vulnerable people. But yeah, before I go on, go ahead, Ace.
Yeah, if you could prove economically that having a child wasn't the reason why you couldn't afford to sustain yourself in old age, but it was a bad economic decision on your part, would you be willing to remove that duty from the child because it wasn't their existence that stopped you from being able to live?
No, because I think
life?
you still gave all of your resources to that child. I don't think that you can just wave off like at least 18, if not more, years of like complete emotional surrender, like complete economic surrender, changing your entire lifestyle and like to devoting to like raising this person. I don't think you can just wave that off as like, well, you know, children didn't opt into receiving that, so who cares if they give anything back? Like, I think that parents devote so much to them that I think that just because you don't have a good relationship with your parents is like not enough of a reason to shirk all of those responsibilities. Emotional distance is not enough of a reason for the state to allow you to completely ignore any kinds of gifts you've been given by your parents for like the incredibly important parts of your life, because all of those infancy, all of those developmental years, if you didn't have the protection of your parents, you'd be pretty shit out of luck, right? So I think that when OG talks to you about this principle, they give you the case of like, because they're vulnerable, we agree with them, but I think Izzy adds on to that by giving you the parental investment argument and talking about the family as a special institution. So now let's go on to the second point of clash, right, about in which world are vulnerable parents better off? Because we get out of OO the idea that like, well, the government should just do it, right? But I think we actually get a pretty substantial case out of OO why the government is like kind of bad or bad in the status quo for like many structural reasons. And I think Izzy continues this case in talking about why like there isn't the right kinds of political capital to get you these social security reforms. So we think that So I think that I think that where Izzy ends up winning this case is talking to you about the ways in which children will lobby for improving the system, right? Because I think we have to concede this debate is about children who don't want to do this, right? The only people who will use these kinds of laws to protect themselves are the kinds of people who like don't want to give back to their parents because otherwise they'd love for their parents would be doing it anyway. But I think what's important about that is those are exactly the kinds of people that will instead lobby the government for creating better social security reforms, better social welfare, and all of that sort of things. So insofar as we concede that governments can do a good job of it, we think we make states better at doing it because we have this political lobby group that's going to advocate for these issues that currently aren't being advocated for. But before I move on, go ahead, Tav.
Okay, maybe you're watching different rounds, because Izzy didn't actually engage with my partner's point about political capital. All she did was make a baseless assertion that people care more about young people than they do old people, which is why tuition is free in America,
Tavish,
and there isn't social services.
Tavish, you missed the last minute and a half of Izzy's speech, in which she explained to you the ways in which this group of people have the political and economic capital to lobby their governments, and will now have the incentive to do so in a world that they currently don't, because they aren't being forced by the state to take care of their parents. So I think that she does give you that incentive link, and I'm sorry that you missed it, right? Because I think that we do, because on this question of where vulnerable parents are better off, and we think that they will be better off when there are better state support systems that they can also opt into, right? We think that is the logical conclusion of our argument. We do think also that caring about vulnerable parents is very important, because while Aislinn wants to get up here and talk to you about all the ways in which this hurts children and we really care about children, I don't know why that necessarily evaporates any relationship that the state has to parents as well, who are just as much a member of that society. And we think that those are the people, these aged people, because of things like job discrimination in terms of the older you get, and because your economic wealth has been depleted because you've devoted all of those resources to your child, you are just a more vulnerable person in society. We think the state should care about you more. I don't think that you can just say that because children should be able to self-actualize, who cares if parents are worse off? I think that you have to engage with the material that Izzy gave you about that. And I think that OG does a good job of explaining how this creates a better emotional culture within families. But I think Izzy takes that the next step further when she talks to you about child activism, because of the incentive they'll have to lighten the burden, because they won't be wanting to pay these sorts of things. I don't think it is enough for the opposition teams to just say, well, you might not like your parents, therefore you don't have any obligation to them, when not having an obligation to them necessarily hurts those people. We think you have to care about the elderly. For all of those reasons, very, very proud to vote.
I'd like to thank the government whip for that speech and invite the opposition whip to come close out the case for the bench and the debate as a whole. You're here.
Opening government is correct that in the traditional case, their parents will have dealt with them for 18 years and then they could potentially move out. And at that point, there would be some form of legal obligation that starts at 18 and continues for the rest of their life until their parents are gone. But what both government teams neglect to address at all is why this is the most important relationship, why this institution ought to be the one that has primacy in us protecting it, when there are many other relationships, particularly ones of choice, that often contribute much more to our growth, to our well-being, or to even the way that we consider the world, right? When Second Gov tells you that the reason we have such strong obligations to parents is they gave you something, first of all, I contest that they are actually the ones that gave you the most. Oftentimes it is people later in your life that change your perspective that have given you the most in terms of development, if that's what they want to hang their hat on. But in terms of financial resources, I actually think that Aislinn gives you a lot of discussion in her extension about why that just makes this the most coercive way to enact the family as an institution. Legally enshrining this perverts the family dynamic if that's the thing they want to protect, and makes it much worse and much unlike the thing that they have a desire to take care of. So how does this affect society, and then how does this change parenting? On the first, I think that Aislinn gives you quite a number of reasons why people ought to be able to maximize their own happiness. She gives you a range of reasons, right? Everything from what is on government trivialized as people just ought to be more happy, which I actually think states do have an incentive to make people more happy, because those are the citizens that are productive, that contribute to that society, or that do any of the things that states want from people. So happier citizens probably just is a net good state goal. But she also tells you that there are lots of reasons why in the family dynamic you might want people to be happy, and why that is something that we ought to prioritize over legally enshrining it. Because Closing Gov is right, that this is most impactfully about the cases where people would need legislation to push them to do this, right? This isn't about the cases where you think your parents gave enough to you that you would take care of them to some extent. It's about the people that we push to do that. And I would point out that all of the other times the government is able to point to of us institutionalizing and legalizing a framework where we must pay for the people we are responsible for, people actually do just shirk that burden and disappear, right? So the political will argument that you get out of Second Gov, try cross-applying that to child support, where people just bail even though they have a filial obligation because they made the kid. It doesn't work that way. People don't see an incentive to get politically involved. They see an incentive to hide from that obligation as much as possible, and so I don't think that flies at all. Secondly, though, in no conditions, people think of the elderly as a burden already. So the political support is eroded to an absolute minimum. I think that this is most important. Recognize that they never talk to you about like what this does. They tell you it's really important that the elderly have lots of services. Both opening and closing gov tell you this is going to affect them. They are a vulnerable group. What they don't address is that that vulnerable group includes people who still need those services who don't have kids. But you've eroded the support for any government programming that doesn't involve your kid paying for the things you need later in life. So the person that has throat cancer but didn't happen to have a baby because that wasn't for them is now completely shunted off to the side. There is absolutely no reason for the state to take care of them because of the way this motion only encapsulates a demographic that chose children. Which furthermore, and this is something that I want to talk about when I get to how this affects parenting, I don't think either government team has compellingly told you why having children is not a lifestyle choice. I don't think, and I'll take you in a second, that either government team has ever proven for you that having children is anything other than a selfish desire on your part to see a human like you in the world. Because when they tell you that like, oh, you'll raise them as an investment and they'll take care of you, then like, why on God's green earth did you not invest in a hedge fund that would do that for you without any of the associated burdens of turning them out the right way so that they like you? Closing.
If people will react as oppositionally as you claim they will to this legislation, why wouldn't they have an incentive to advocate for better welfare and more reform, the same way that they advocate for child reform and welfare in the status quo?
So I actually just don't think that most people do politically advocate at all. I think their political advocacy is like, I'm not paying my child support and I'll get taken to court for it and then I'll fight it. They don't start banners and go marching around Washington to say we should get rid of the institution writ large. They complain about it in their personal, contextualized circumstances. That's why I want to talk about how this affects parenting, right? Because when Aislinn tells you that the family institution is incredibly oppressive as it stands in status quo, that is only worsened by the things that government describes for you. If political advocacy is a thing, think about the way this affects two different groups of people. One, the group of people that hate this policy and out themselves as people who hate the family and don't want to pay for parents. I think they're going to suffer an awful lot in terms of political capital being given to them at all. Secondly, think about the way that this just affects people that for whatever reason, whether or not their parents, and I'll take you in a second, gave them the minimum, just aren't interested in the life their parents gave them. Somehow, even though that life is antithetical to you, they raise you with views that make you upset or sick, they made you feel bad about things in the absolute worst case scenario, or even they just didn't do things you really liked, you are still somehow obligated to subsidize a lifestyle you would otherwise never support. Like, the reason that this is different from taxes is that, like, taxes will end up benefiting you because they will provide you additionally with services you might use. Your parents will never provide you with those extra services, particularly if the kind you're relationship with is because you pay. Opening.
So which programs that take care of the elderly currently do you believe are both financially possible and have support and aren't being cut in the status quo?
So look, Aislinn and I don't have to defend that our side will miraculously create more support. We have to defend that their side will make it much less likely, and that we think that, like, yeah, there's room for improvement. Perhaps another motion would deal with forcing us to explain how we get there. But I think what is notable is that the government case makes many more cases much more likely of harming what programs already don't get enough funding. I think that's the problem. So the other thing about how this affects parenting then, think about the dynamic that you produce, right? You incentivize parenting in excess because that's the best way to convince your kids you loved them and them to support you. I don't think this always works, and I think it actually turns out really bad kids a lot of the time. But secondly, think about how coercive it is when someone who actually is of an age where they're not financially independent but can rationalize what their parents are doing with their money at 16 has to think about whether it's reasonable to say, please, Mom and Dad, don't spend the extra money on getting me that thing for Christmas because I'm going to owe you for it later when you don't have money in your pension. Like, I think there is an age at which kids can rationalize that out for themselves but have no meaningful way to interact because of the confines of the family dynamic with convincing their parents that they have enough authority or stake. This motion forces those kids to have a future obligation for things that they in no way have a say in. That's the other reason that this isn't like taxes, because at least nominally you could vote for a party that says, I don't want to pay that much taxation. You can't do that with this motion. You can't swap for parents that are going to ask less of you. That's why the birth lottery is incredibly problematic, and what Aislinn gives you is important. People are not going to lobby this away because they are not going to try and publicly shirk a coercive institution they have no control over being born into, and it meaningfully harms those who choose not to participate in it already. Very proud to oppose.
I'd like to thank the opposition whip for that speech and everyone for this debate. I'd like to invite both sides of the House to rise.